The story begins in a vast village where wealth and land determined respect, and among the grand households stood the mansion of a powerful millionaire whose influence stretched across the fields, rivers, and markets of the region. His word was law, his decisions final, and those who served in his home either rose with honor or fell into disgrace depending on how he viewed them. Among his servants was a humble maid, a woman of great loyalty and diligence, who served with her husband by her side. They were poor but content, finding dignity in their work and hope in the small piece of land the millionaire had granted them to till. That land was their lifeline, their anchor in a world where survival was never guaranteed. For years the maid labored in silence, sweeping the wide courtyards, preparing meals, and maintaining her duties with unwavering dedication. Her husband, though not a servant within the mansion, often helped in tasks when needed, and together they created an image of honesty and faithfulness that the rest of the household admired. But envy is a seed that sprouts in the darkest corners, and not every servant rejoiced at the sight of their modest happiness. Another maid in the household, driven by jealousy and greed, watched them closely, searching for a way to tarnish their name and bring ruin upon them. Her heart hardened each day as she compared her own struggles with the quiet bond shared between the loyal maid and her husband. One evening, when whispers of missing valuables began to stir within the household, the jealous maid seized her chance. She fabricated allegations, claiming that the faithful maid and her husband had stolen from the millionaire. With carefully planted lies and feigned tears, she painted them as thieves, accusing them of betrayal against the very master who had sheltered them. The millionaire, blinded by anger and pride, did not wait for truth. He saw the accusation as a stain on his authority and a betrayal of trust. In his fury, he summoned the couple before the eyes of the village and humiliated them. He stripped them not only of their dignity, but also of the small plot of land they had nurtured with sweat and toil. The humiliation was unbearable. The maid wept, her cries echoing through the village as her husband held her hand, powerless to defend their honor against the wrath of wealth and power. The millionaire's voice thundered as he cast them out, declaring them unworthy of even the smallest place in his domain. The villagers, though some doubted the truth of the allegations, dared not speak in defense of the poor couple, for to challenge the millionaire was to invite ruin upon oneself. And so the maid and her husband, stripped of their home, their livelihood and their good name, were forced to leave the village with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the sorrow in their hearts. The path ahead of them was long and merciless. They walked barefoot along dusty roads, the scorching sun beating down on their weary bodies, the shadows of shame following them wherever they went. The maid's husband tried to console her, but his own spirit was fractured by the injustice of their exile. Nights were cold, days unforgiving, and hunger gnawed at them as they searched for shelter in distant places where no one knew their names. Yet even in their suffering, they clung to one another, believing that time might one day bring a measure of justice, though their hope was faint. It was during this period of exile that the maid gave birth to a son. He was born into hardship, cradled not in luxury but in the arms of struggle. The couple saw in him the spark of a future they themselves had been denied. His cries gave them purpose, his tiny breaths renewed their strength, and though they were still haunted by the weight of false accusations, they resolved to raise him with values of dignity, resilience, and truth. Their life was hard, but each day they worked tirelessly to give the boy a chance at survival. They gathered firewood, labored in fields for meager wages, and endured the scorn of strangers who believed them to be the thieves their old village had declared them to be. The boy grew surrounded by the bitterness of injustice, but within his heart burned a fire his parents carefully nurtured. They told him of the betrayal they had suffered, not to make him bitter, but to instill in him the resolve to live with honor and never forget the importance of truth. They warned him of envy and greed, of how quickly falsehood could destroy the lives of the innocent, and as he grew, he carried those stories with him like weapons forged in silence, shaping his character, sharpening his will, and planting the seed of determination that one day he would rise above the shadows cast upon his family. But the weight of their suffering never left the maid or her husband. The humiliation they endured lingered in every step they took, and in every village they entered, they carried the invisible burden of disgrace. At night, when the world was quiet, the maid would weep softly, remembering the land that was taken, the cruel accusations that shattered their peace, and the laughter of those who watched their downfall. Her husband, though strong, felt helpless as he watched her pain unfold year after year. And yet, amid their sorrow, they never let go of the hope that their son might carry their story forward and restore the dignity that had been ripped from them. The boy, though young, observed the resilience of his parents. He saw his father's hands, rough and scarred from endless labor, and his mother's eyes clouded with sorrow yet lit with love. He learned early that survival demanded both strength and patience, and that injustice, though it could wound deeply, could also become the foundation for transformation. Every hardship, every humiliation, and every sacrifice laid the groundwork for the destiny that awaited him, for though he was born into exile, his spirit was not bound by it. And so the years passed, each season carrying with it new trials and new lessons. The boy grew taller, his shoulders stronger, his mind sharper. He worked alongside his parents, but unlike them, he carried no chains of submission to the memory of the millionaire's cruelty. Instead, he held within himself a determination that one day he would return to the very village that cast them out, not as a broken child of the exiled, but as a man who would confront the injustice, reclaim honor, and rewrite the legacy of his family. The years of exile hardened the maid and her husband, shaping their son into a child who understood that life was not given in comfort, but earned through struggle. The boy grew in an environment where hunger was a constant teacher and shelter a fragile blessing. Each day was a battle against despair, yet within him there was a quiet strength that even his parents could not fully explain. Though he saw them weary, bowed under the weight of injustice, he did not inherit their brokenness. Instead, he absorbed their pain and transformed it into determination. The family lived on the edges of villages where no one welcomed them. They slept in abandoned huts, in fields after long days of labor, or beneath the open sky when there was no roof to shield them. Work was scarce, and when work was found, it was often the harshest, reserved for those without dignity or bargaining power. The maid carried baskets on her back until her spine ached, and her husband dug into the earth with bare hands when no tools were provided. Their pay was barely enough for food, often nothing more than scraps or grain that others rejected. Yet they never allowed their son to go without, even if it meant they themselves went hungry. The boy learned early to share their burdens. As soon as he was old enough, he joined his father in the fields, gathering sticks, pulling weeds, and carrying loads heavier than his small frame could bear. His body grew lean and strong, not from luxury or choice, but from necessity. He did not complain, for he had seen enough of life to understand that complaints changed nothing. Instead, he carried in his heart the memory of his mother's tears on the day they were cast out, and the fury in his father's silence when their land was stripped away. That memory guided him more powerfully than any teacher, reminding him that injustice was not a fate to be accepted, but a fire that could forge a new destiny. The maid often sat by him at night, telling him stories of their past, not in bitterness but as lessons. She told him how envy could destroy friendships, how lies could poison even the richest heart, and how truth, though buried by power, could never be erased. Her husband added his own wisdom, teaching the boy that strength was not just in the arm but in the will, and that patience was a greater weapon than rage. These lessons shaped him into a child far older than his years, a boy whose eyes carried both the weight of sorrow and the spark of ambition. Seasons came and went, and the boy's body grew into that of a young man. His arms were hardened by labor, his legs strong from endless walking, his back straight from enduring hardship. He had no riches, no land, no inheritance, but he carried within him something far more powerful, the will to rise above the shame placed upon his family. In every task, he pushed himself harder than others, as though testing his strength for the battles he knew would come. When he worked in fields, he worked longer than the rest. When he lifted loads, he lifted until his muscles trembled. When others rested, he sought out ways to train his endurance. The boy's spirit began to draw the attention of those around him. Though he was still regarded as the child of exiles, some saw the spark in his eyes and the unyielding strength in his frame. He carried himself with quiet pride, never begging, never bowing, but always honoring his parents with his labor. His reputation grew quietly, whispered among workers who admired his determination. Yet he never allowed pride to blind him. He remembered the cruel hand of the millionaire and the lies that had destroyed his family, and he vowed that if he were ever to rise, it would be not through arrogance but through justice. But hardship did not end. His parents, worn by years of toil, began to weaken. The maid's hands, once steady, now trembled from the years of carrying burdens, and her husband's body, once strong, grew frail from endless work without rest. The boy saw their decline and felt the urgency in his heart to act. He could not allow their suffering to have been in vain. He needed to build a path not only for himself, but for the honor of those who had given everything to keep him alive. The turning point came when a severe drought struck the land. Crops withered, rivers dried, and hunger spread like a shadow across villages. Many families abandoned their homes in search of survival, and chaos followed. Thieves prowled the roads, desperate men turned violent, and communities crumbled under the weight of scarcity. It was in this time of despair that the boy's strength became a light. He refused to give in to desperation. He hunted in the forests, gathered roots, and found ways to provide not only for his parents but also for others who were left starving. Slowly, his name spread as one who did not falter in the face of calamity. He became known as a protector of the weak, a provider in times of famine, and a youth who stood firm when others wavered. The same villagers who once looked upon him as the child of disgraced exiles began to whisper of his courage and determination. Respect grew where there had once been only contempt, yet he never forgot the source of his journey. Every time he provided for another, he remembered the day his parents were cast out. Every time he was praised, he remembered the silence of those who had once watched their humiliation. Years passed, and the boy became a man whose presence commanded attention. His eyes, once filled with the innocence of childhood, now carried the sharpness of one who had endured suffering and overcome it. His body was a testament to resilience, carved by years of hardship and labor. His spirit was a flame that could not be extinguished, no matter how the winds of life tried to snuff it out. His parents, though frail, looked upon him with pride, knowing that their story had not ended in disgrace, but was being rewritten through the strength of their son. And deep within the man's heart, a promise grew stronger each day. He would return to the village that had rejected them. He would confront the shadow of the millionaire's cruelty, the lies of the maid who had accused them, and the silence of those who had watched without helping. He would not return as the child of shame, but as a man of strength, honor, and justice. And when that day came, the world would see that exile had not destroyed him. It had created him. Time moved forward, and the boy, now a man carved by hardship, had grown into his full strength. His body stood broad and unyielding, his mind sharpened by years of carrying burdens that most would not have survived, and his spirit burned with the fire of purpose. He had endured hunger, humiliation, and the endless toil of exile, yet those trials had not broken him. They had made him unshakable. The people in distant villages now knew his name, spoken with respect for his ability to lead, to protect, and to endure. He had become more than just the son of outcasts. He had become a man others instinctively followed. The years of labor and survival had forged within him not only strength, but also wisdom. He had studied the ways of men, observed the weakness of greed, and learned the value of loyalty. He understood the suffering of the poor because he had lived it. He understood the cruelty of the powerful because he had felt it. And he understood the silence of the masses because he had witnessed it. Every lesson of his life became a stone in the foundation of the man he had become. When word reached him of the death of the old millionaire who had humiliated his parents, he felt no triumph, no joy. The man had carried power in life, but death had stripped him of everything. Yet the shadow of his cruelty remained, because the lies that had destroyed the maid and her husband still lingered in the village's memory. The land that had been taken was still gone. The disgrace that had been thrown upon them still whispered in corners. The jealous maid who had accused them was still alive, still moving through life with her poison unchecked. The time had come for him to return, not as a boy in rags, but as a man who carried the weight of justice. He prepared his parents first, for he knew the journey would awaken old wounds. His mother, her hair now streaked with grey, trembled at the thought of walking the roads back to the place where she had been shamed. His father, though weaker in body, nodded with solemn resolve, knowing that this was not just a return but a reckoning. Together with what little they had, they set out. The road back to the village felt different now. The dust that once clung to their tired feet when they had been driven away now rose beneath the steps of a man who walked with purpose. When they arrived, the village had changed in size and shape, but the heart of it remained the same. Fields stretched wide, homes dotted the land, and in the center stood the gathering place where judgments were once made, and where their own humiliation had unfolded years earlier. Some recognized them, whispers spreading quickly through the crowd. Many were shocked to see the once banished family return, but their attention soon shifted to the son who now walked beside them. He was no longer the frail child they had seen years ago. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that spoke of storms endured and survived. His presence commanded silence. At first, the villagers watched cautiously, uncertain of what his return would mean. But it did not take long for them to see the strength of his character. He spoke not in words but in actions. He helped repair fields that had been damaged by floods, defended the weak from those who preyed upon them, and carried himself as one who belonged not on the fringes, but at the center of leadership. Slowly, people began to look to him not as the child of exiles, but as a protector, a guide, a man who brought order where there was chaos. The current chief of the village, a man advanced in years, took notice of him. The chief's daughter, a young woman of kindness and compassion, had heard whispers of his story. When she learned of the injustice that had been done to his parents, her heart ached with sorrow. She saw in him not just strength, but the scars of a past carved by cruelty. She wept when she first heard the tale, for she understood what it meant to be crushed by lies and betrayed by silence. And in those tears a bond was quietly formed, though unspoken. But before love could grow, justice demanded its place. The man knew that his parents' honor could not be restored until the truth was revealed. The jealous maid who had accused them still lived in the village, now older, but still carrying herself with the arrogance of one who had never faced consequence. She had prospered in their absence, feeding off the lie she had planted, enjoying the rewards of deception. But her time had come. The man began to gather evidence, not in documents or records, but in the stories of those who had been present. He found old servants who remembered, who had seen the jealous maid's behavior, who had long whispered their doubts but never dared to speak aloud. Now in the presence of a man they trusted, their voices found courage. The truth, long buried under fear, began to surface. One by one, the testimonies painted a picture of the lie. The villagers began to murmur, shame growing in their hearts as they realized they had stood silent while innocence was destroyed. The man, however, did not seek only words. He demanded accountability. He confronted the accuser not with rage, but with the unyielding presence of truth. And when the moment came, before the eyes of the same village that had once watched his parents humiliated, the truth was revealed. The jealous maid's lies crumbled. Her guilt was undeniable, her shame unmasked for all to see. The villagers who had once turned away from the suffering of the maid and her husband now lowered their heads, realizing their complicity in silence. The man's parents, frail but still standing, wept as their honor was restored. For the first time in years they lifted their heads not in sorrow but in dignity, knowing that their suffering had not been in vain. The man's influence grew stronger with each passing day. He had not only avenged his family's honor, but had also shown the village what leadership meant: strength, justice, and compassion. The old chief, recognizing the will of the people and the natural authority of the young man, began to prepare him as his successor. And when the time came, the villagers accepted him not as the son of exiles, but as their new leader, a chief born from the fire of suffering and the strength of endurance. As chief, he ruled with fairness, remembering always the sting of injustice. He punished the guilty, but he also uplifted the innocent. He restored land to those who had been robbed, gave voice to those who had been silenced, and brought balance to a village that had once thrived on fear. And at his side the daughter of the chief stood, her compassion matching his strength. Their bond grew into love, sealed not by wealth or power, but by shared understanding and the tears she had shed when she first heard his story. Thus the man who had once been cast out returned not in shame, but in triumph. His parents, though weary from years of toil, lived long enough to see their honor restored. Their son seated as chief, and the legacy of lies overturned by truth. The jealous maid who had destroyed them was punished, her name forever stained by the very shame she had tried to cast on others. Justice had come full circle, but for the man this was more than revenge. It was the fulfillment of a destiny born in exile, forged in hardship, and realized in truth. His rise to chiefdom was not only the story of one family's redemption, but the reminder that power without justice destroys, and suffering endured with resilience transforms. The village that had once cast the maid and her husband into the dust now gathered in respect before their son, who had risen above humiliation to claim the mantle of leadership. As the new chief, his presence radiated strength and dignity, a reminder of the storms he had endured and the mountains he had climbed, yet his heart carried neither arrogance nor vanity, for he knew too well how fragile power could be, how swiftly respect could turn into fear, and how easily injustice could destroy lives. His first task as chief was to set in order the wrongs that had been allowed to grow unchecked in the soil of silence. The jealous maid who had destroyed his parents' lives became the first symbol of accountability. No longer hidden by lies, her guilt was undeniable. Her punishment was not cruel for cruelty's sake, but measured with the weight of justice. She was stripped of the comforts she had stolen through deceit, cast from the center of the village into the edges where she had once forced others to live. Her name became a curse on the lips of those who once admired her, a warning of what envy and lies could do. The people watched, and in that moment they understood that a new kind of leadership had begun, one that would not allow poison to spread unchecked. But justice did not end with her. The man turned his eyes upon the structures of power that had supported the millionaire's pride. Though the old master was dead, his wealth had left roots in the soil, and some still clung to his legacy with greed. The lands that had been taken unjustly from the poor were reclaimed, restored to those who had labored without reward. The fields were redistributed not to enrich the few, but to feed the many. It was a transformation that shook the very balance of the village, but it was necessary. For too long the people had bowed to power without question, but now they saw a chief who understood hunger, who understood loss, and who refused to let injustice rule. As his authority grew, so too did the trust of the people. They brought their disputes before him, and he judged with fairness. He listened not only to the voices of men, but also to the voices of women, the elderly and the youth, for he knew that wisdom was not bound by age or gender, but lived in every heart willing to speak truth. He became known as a leader who carried the strength of a warrior but the heart of a father, one who defended fiercely yet guided gently. Yet leadership was never without challenge. There were those who envied his rise, those who whispered in corners that he had climbed to power too swiftly, that his blood was not noble, that he carried the stain of exile even if honor had been restored. Some of these whispers came from neighboring villages, where chiefs feared his growing influence. They tested him, sending small raiding parties to strike at his fields, probing to see whether the new chief could defend what he now ruled. And he did. He led his warriors with precision, not for conquest but for defense, teaching them discipline born of his years of endurance. Each skirmish proved that his strength was no illusion. His leadership was not inherited. It was earned, and it was unshakable. In the midst of these trials, his bond with the daughter of the old chief deepened. She had first wept when she heard his story, and her tears had been a river that carved a path into his heart. As days turned into months, their companionship grew into something greater. She saw in him not just the chief, not just the avenger of wrongs, but the man who had carried his parents' suffering with dignity and transformed it into purpose. He saw in her the compassion that balanced his strength, the tenderness that softened the edges of his resolve. Their love was not born of sudden passion, but of shared understanding, of respect that grew into affection, of admiration that became devotion. The villagers began to speak of their union as inevitable, a bond that would seal the new era of justice with the blessing of love. The daughter of the chief, who had once feared the corruption of power, now saw in him a man who could wield authority without arrogance. And he, who had once thought his life would be shaped only by revenge, discovered that love could give meaning even to a life carved by hardship. But before joy could be complete, the weight of leadership demanded more from him. A season of famine threatened the land once again, and the people looked to him for survival. Unlike the famine of his youth, he was no longer powerless. He organized the village, rationed food, sought new sources of water, and ensured that no family was left to starve. He opened the stores of grain that had been hoarded by the greedy and distributed them equally. breaking the cycle of hoarding that had plagued the village for generations. His actions saved lives, and his people saw in him not only a chief but a savior, one who remembered the taste of hunger and would never allow it to rule again. Through famine, raids, and whispers of envy, he stood firm, and with each trial, his leadership grew unshakable. His parents, though weak with age, lived to see the fullness of his triumph. They watched as the same villagers who had once turned their backs now bowed in respect, as their son restored not only their honor, but also their names in the memory of the people. Their tears of sorrow became tears of joy, for their suffering had not been wasted. It had given birth to a legacy that would outlive them. At last, the day came when the union between the chief and the daughter of the old leader was celebrated. The village gathered, not in whispers of scandal as they had once done, but in songs of joy. They sang of the boy who had been cast out, who had returned as a man, who had faced injustice and turned it into justice, who had been denied dignity but rose to restore it. Their songs told of love, of strength, of resilience, of a new era where truth reigned and envy was crushed. The jealous maid who had begun it all, now reduced to nothing, lived in the shadows, watching the celebration from afar. Consumed by the bitterness of her downfall, she was the living reminder of what envy could do, and her life became a warning whispered to every generation after. The boy she had tried to destroy had risen to heights she could never touch, and her shame was eternal. And so the village entered a new chapter, led by a chief whose throne had been carved not from inheritance, but from hardship, whose crown was not gold but the respect of his people, and whose heart was not chained by revenge but freed by justice and love.